Hello, everyone, and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of ChalkboardNews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education. Brendan Clary, Chalkboard's K-12 editor, will join me today to talk about one of those issues facing education across the country. Brendan, how are you?
I'm well, Dan. How about yourself?
I am doing well, thank you. Brendan, you reported on recently about a group of schools in the state of Missouri that sought and were granted a waiver allowing them to end of school standardized testing. Most schools across the country use standardized testing to judge where their students are at various grade levels, yet these schools in Missouri are going to stop doing that? What's happening now?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing that I was able to dig into last week. Basically, this group of 20 schools received a waiver from the state, and that's a pretty key detail there from the state to end of school standardized testing, so end of year, like how much do our students know sort of thing. And they are instead going to pursue what they call interim assessments or like throughout the year assessments for students. So they're not getting rid of testing altogether. They're not getting rid of standardized testing, but they're saying, how do we test? Their idea is, how do we figure out what students know before it's too late? So the question that they're asking is, how do we test students in the middle of the year, like maybe during a unit that we're teaching, so that we can understand if they've got it or not? And if they do, great, we can move on. If not, let's focus on this, get it to individual students who are still not understanding the material. So the question is now, can they figure out how to distill that data and turn it into something that is comparable to an end-of-year assessment? And so that is the trick, and I think that that's something that they're going to work on with the state. Now, I talked to somebody with the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's Office of Quality Schools, and from how she described it, the State Board of Education voted unanimously to do this, and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, they are very involved in helping this group of schools figure out how to sort of navigate this process of changing what kinds of assessments that they're using while still maintaining, accountability standards. So they're not getting rid of, at first glance, it sounds like, okay, they're getting rid of testing, but they're just kind of changing how they're testing, and they have a specific reason to do that. And they're saying, we don't want to do the end of year testing because we just don't want to have to double up on the testing on students and burden them in that way. So it's an interesting sort of approach to how to think about education, and specifically, how do we think about end-of-year testing? Like, is there an alternative to it? And so there's an innovation waiver section that the Missouri Board of Education was able to grant them this through.
And as I understand it from your reporting, Brendan, these schools will still need to get a waiver from the U.S. Department of Education to end this end-of-year testing, but there is somewhat some precedent for that because Montana received a federal assessment waiver, but it's not apples to apples exactly, right?
Right. So yes, the U.S. Department of Education would also need to grant a waiver for them to be able to stop doing this altogether, because at this point, the end-of-year testing is required by federal law. And so that would be, a hurdle that they would have to jump. But that is, as you mentioned, Montana has received a federal assessment waiver. And as you said, it's a little different. There are some, key differences, including Montana's pilot program has only one interim assessment, and I think that this one would be multiple tests per year. So I think that there's a little bit of that apples to oranges sort of comparison. And I also heard from the person I talked to, Lisa Serino, the assistant commissioner in Missouri's Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, which is a very long name for the Department of Education there. She told me that, Montana's also been very forward about pushing that to their schools. And so that's not necessarily the case here in Missouri, that, this is a group of 20 schools in sort of a program that is requesting this. So there's a little bit of a different approach, I think, where the state in Montana has asked the federal Department of Education for that process. But in Missouri, the state is willing to help facilitate that and is willing to work with a group of 20 schools that are part of the Success Ready Students Network. And that is sort of the facilitator, I think, that's kind of driving this forward.
Now, Brendan, just in the few moments that we have left, are there any detractors to what these Missouri schools are trying to do? What's the argument against? Is because you're talking about multiple mid-year tests? Some teachers I know push back on these standardized tests as you're teaching towards the test. if they're going to have multiple. I mean, I don't know. What is the argument against?
I'm not sure. I didn't see any specifically against the Success Ready Students Network approach to do multiple tests per year, but I have heard that if you're kind of teaching toward a test, then that can take a lot of instructional time. I imagine though, if you're kind of reframing it and you're like, we're trying to actually test and see what students know, and so instead of teaching to maybe like a standardized test that is maybe or maybe not relevant to what students are learning, if you had bespoke tests like these interim assessments that were tailored to our content standards and to our classroom and to these specific classes, then that might be more fruitful in terms of we're actually figuring out what students need to know to pass this class instead of what do they need to know for the standardized test. So I mean, that was even in my own experience taking the ACT. I had to go to special seminars to figure out, okay, how do you take the ACT? Because it was like sort of related to what I was learning in class in high school, but not 100%. So there wasn't not a lot of overlap. So if you can get if you can get the overlap of the assessments down, then that actually might give you more freedom there. But I haven't seen any specific criticisms of this necessarily, except for maybe those who would say, okay, is there not going to be any standardized testing? And so I think that was something that Suino made very clear when I was talking with her, that they're still going to be giving assessments and they're still accountable to the state, and that there are actually a lot of safeguards in place. So I think we're not just letting them go off and do their own thing here for the next 3 years. It's still very much tied to certain performance measures, and if they can't make it happen, then I think that they're going to lose their ability to do this. So,
well, thank you for your insight, Brendan, but that is all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with this story and all stories related to K-12 education at chalkboardnews.com. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.